G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle, and brief episode today. Just want to pick up on some comments on the previous video, in particular people talking about the narrative element of the game, and how they feel that the game is trying to be very narrative in its writing, and perhaps that's why there are such great power disparities. Now, I don't disagree with this on the surface of it. The narrative aspect is very important to the game. The problem is, though, there has to be a balance, I think we all recognise, between narrative and gameplay on the tabletop. And I'll give an example of that. So, in narrative terms, a Space Marine is such a superior, genetically enhanced warrior that they could carve through, 100 militia. One Marine through 100 militia. I think we would all say that's probably pretty reasonable, untrained, unskilled citizenry versus 2-century-old, incredibly highly trained superhuman in powered armoured suit who weighs over a ton, stands 2.5 meters tall, can literally just punch holes through the chests of people, and armed with a plethora of weapons which can just devastate the area around them, whilst being faster than human eye can perceive. So naturally they would carve through them. But you wouldn't play a game like that, because a game like that you'd need hundreds of militia on the tabletop for every one Marine. So what do? Do you have, on the one hand, a player has 1,000 infantry, right, to represent their militia company, and the Space Marine player gets a single tactical squad? You don't get any of the cool stuff then. You don't have the tanks, the dreadnoughts, the characters. I mean, imagine a Primarch in that situation. How many lesser humans can a Primarch carve through? We know they have near infinite stamina, among other things. So there has to be some extrapolation that goes on when we go, okay, look, we know that the basic humans can't stand up to Astartes. We need to compensate for it in other ways. Let's give them war machines, for example, basilisks and medusas, big artillery, or tanks, or sentinels, or ogrins. All sorts of items are available that can be used to allow it so that you need to bring less physical bodies. And there is a balancing fact that goes on here. One of my problems with Heresy 2 is that there are narrative elements in there which seem really cool on the surface. One I often point to is movement. They added all these unique and individual movement values into the game. And some people will sit there and go, oh, it's so good, it's so narrative. And I go, I think it's terrible, because you've added another layer of complexity, which doesn't add so much to the game that I sit there just marveling every time I move a unit going, wow, I feel so cool that this Terminator unit moves 1 inch less than that Terminator unit because of their unique armor type. I'm so engrossed in the game. That's not my reaction. My reaction is, oh, fuck, that's right. This unit has to do this, and it has this extra special rule that I have to take into consideration, because that's what they consider narrative, and, the balance point just isn't there. So, these are considerations that I think need to be taken into account when it comes to writing and setting up a game. Narrative cannot come at the sake of gameplay in something that is explicitly marketed as a game. Narrative belongs in your novels, in your stories. It belongs in maybe the background construction of your list, the fluff that justifies the army that you're taking, or the background narrative of a particular campaign or battle that you're undertaking. It's a secondary consideration when it comes to actually playing the game. And I think this is lost on people, and I think is especially lost on the writers, because they'll write things and think that it's narrative, and it just blows up in all of our faces. Great example of that are Atramentar. Atramentar are meant to be this terrifying elite unit of murderers. They're explicitly sold to us in the books as such. In the pocket of Sevatar, he's their first captain after all. And yet what we've got on the tabletop is this group of guys who are very underwhelming by Terminator standards, especially underwhelming by Atramentar's fluff and background perception, so they don't live up to that. And instead they've changed the narrative focus of them by saying that, oh, well, they're Night Lords, they're just murderers, they're unskilled, they just know how to murder people with their backs turned to them. And then at the same time, they want to turn around and say, well, Comrade Curze is this weapon skill 8 murder machine who's better than half of the other Primarchs in close combat. And yet all Comrade Curze has ever trained against is basic humans. He never fought any of the crazy Xenos in his foundational years that someone like the Lion or Ferrus Manus fought on their home worlds, let alone Berserker Primarch like Angron, for example. He has just mysteriously this super high skill threshold because someone wrote him that way one time in the Heresy novels, and it's just stuck with him. Now Comrade Curze is this insane powerhouse of a Primarch. So the fluff and the tabletop doesn't marry up there, and then in his own Legion it doesn't marry up either, but in polar opposite ways. One overhypes and the other completely undersells itself. It's really, really bizarre. And I don't think it's a great excuse for the performance of these things on the tabletop. We saw it especially with things like Solar Auxiliary and Militia. People will say in the comments, and I have no problem with them saying it either, I really want to stress that, people are entitled to hold the viewpoint that the game is better for it. I just disagree with it. And when people say, the Solar Auxiliary shouldn't be able to take on the Astartes one-on-one, I'm not going to sit here and say that they're wrong, because I agree, they shouldn't. I shouldn't be seeing Solar Auxilia versus Space Marine one-on-one, or even one-on-two, two Solar Auxilia versus a Space Marine, and the Solar Auxilia come out on top. Except obviously with bad rolling, which is just a luck-based element. But the Solar Auxilia have tools which should allow them to come out on top, such as a Solar Auxilia Rapier battery should have many times the firepower of an Astartes, and should be a leveling tool, as it were, a force multiplier that takes up some of that slack. Same with the armoured vehicles. But unfortunately, the gameplay as implemented, they don't quite work that way. The strongest example of that being something like the armoured vehicles, Basilisk Medusa, even take the regular Leman Russ and the battle cannon. The battle cannon is described as something that's able to blow apart tanks. It can't blow apart a single Marine who, although they're heavily armoured by the standards of an infantryman, are not a tank. And the battle cannon just cannot hurt basic Space Marines fundamentally. So we again have this impasse of the fluff says one thing, the gameplay just does another. And I don't think it's a crutch that should be lent on. If you're going to design a game and you want the fluff in there, I think the fluff aspects are best represented by things like elite units and elite special rules that go with them. Buffs for a Primarch bodyguard unit if they're actually bodyguarding the Primarch. That's a great place to introduce a buff in the rules where tabletop and fluff can come together and make up a whole that is superior to the sum of its parts. Conversely, you have Legion traits which are all over the shop, and you may say that they're all thematic to some degree, but when the thematic Legion traits all play out at fundamental different levels on the tabletop, and it had some provide bonuses which apply to the entire army repeatedly throughout the game, every single turn, it's going to achieve results. Versus for some armies, it's a one-off. They're going to get it one time, that buff, one trait, and it's not going to stand out. Something like a Raven Guard. It's like, okay, you get to infiltrate. Oh, nowhere to infiltrate? Well, I guess you just wasted your Legionaries Astartes this game. Meanwhile, the guy opposite you is playing Iron Warriors, and, every time he shoots at your Dreadnoughts or your vehicles, he gets +1 on all his damage rolls, gets an additional +1 strength to all his anti-tank weapons, just because they just hate you, so they just fire guns harder. It doesn't make sense, see? I think this is a problem that, obviously, I've stressed it from the 30k point of view, but it only gets worse when you look at other game systems. If you want to look at something like Age of Sigmar, you have characters who are meant to be gods or on par with gods, like Nagash or Archaon, and they are strong for sure, but then they can get taken down by the weakest units in the game if you just hoard them up on them long enough, and you have some good rolling and a mixture of bad rolling on behalf of the person playing the god, as it were, then they can be taken down. And that's very narratively unrewarding. But this is what happens when you have a company that positions these characters in such a way that they're so much larger than life. It's the Catan problem. Catan for the Necrons for decades were these gods, or for a decade, I should say, were these gods among the Necrons. And when you took something like the Nightbringer, it was terrifying. But then the game power crept along, and then the Nightbringer starts to get beaten by just generic Astartes commanders. All of a sudden, it's, well, actually, they're shards. They're shards of Catan. Far, far weaker than the individual Catan themselves. See, and then this whole narrative thing has to change. I think we're seeing also problems with this with the Primarchs returning in 40k, where they're supposed to be these larger-than-life characters, and then the people writing the rules are trying to make them more interesting than they are in 30k, which is... yeah. Let's just say some of these things don't make sense. Why has the Lion got a shield now? Why is it the Emperor's shield? Why is he able to teleport from forest to forest? That's a really dumb power. Who wrote this? You should be ashamed. But unfortunately, these people have been given the keys to the car. They're Ferris Bueller. They've got the Ferrari. And unfortunately, there are consequences to the bad writing. And that bad writing in the fluff makes its way into the game. And this would be forgivable in any new company. Games Workshop's are not a new company. They've been around since the 70s. 40k has been around since the end of the 80s. At what point do we say something's 3 going on 4 decades old in the case of 40k? 4 decades in a couple of years' time. That's a long time to be around as a game system. And yet we see so many disparities and issues with the rules to this date. And yet the company wants to tell us, oh no, we're not a games company, we're a miniatures company. But they're called Games Workshop. They sell games. Their store is full of games. And they have a section called Board Games. Games is everywhere in the advertising. And they've had decades to refine and improve and expand. And instead, what we keep getting every edition, I want to harp on this point that I've spoken about in many other videos, is what we get every edition is an excuse for a new edition. We don't have them fixing all the things that people say are wrong in the previous edition. And we see that with Heresy. Heresy 2 is not a fix of Heresy 1. Heresy 1's issues were not solved by Heresy 2. All that happened by creating a new system was all new problems, because they changed so many fundamentals of the game. We see this also in 40k. People had issues with the way that power creep was occurring in 9th edition 40k, and what I heard from the 40k community, please, if you play a lot of 40k, correct me if I'm wrong here, but people were just saying, go back to the start of 8th edition and the indexes. That was a good game. That was where the game should be at. And yet they didn't do that. Instead, they create 10th edition and they do something different again. It's like they won't sit down as a company and refine what they've already created. Instead, they would rather just try and do a fresh draft each time. Let's start from scratch and make a fresh draft. And maybe that's part of the sales tactic. Like, they have to say, look, we've changed the game and its fundamentals. That's how we justify a new edition, rather than changing so little about the previous edition that just really FAQs it and fixes it. It's like they're afraid to do that. Maybe they will think people won't buy it if there's not enough hype. Maybe that's part of the marketing spin. And the way that this ties into the fact that they want to sort of hype everything up so much, and, well, this better represents the fluff, and the game's more narrative than it's ever been before, whilst at the same time dumbing down the actual gameplay elements. It's very weird how it goes. But yeah, I don't think there is any point to trying to prop up the company and say, well, the writers are doing their best to establish a narrative, and that's why it's badly written as a game. because I think you can be well written as a game and well written as narrative. The two can feed off each other really well, and I think Heresy 1 did that spectacularly. Heresy 2 is a far inferior system, and unfortunately, the thing that I'm growing more and more aware of every day is that Heresy 2 can be fixed. But the things that are broken, they are refusing to fix. So the game cannot live up to its potential, and the potential is there to make it a game as good as Heresy 1, but it needs repairs dramatically to core fundamentals of the game system. And no amount of, well, it's trying to be narrative will ever fix that. Anyway, I'm Mac with the Outer Circle. Please leave your thoughts on what I've had to say today in the comments below, and I'll catch you on the next video.